Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Debra Maldonado.
And I'm Dr. Rob.
And we are continuing our series on the shadow. And today we're going deeper into relationships.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about dear old mom and the mother complex. But before we begin, I do want to remind you to subscribe to our podcast. If you're listening to us on iTunes, Spotify, any of those services, we'd love to have you come by every week and listen to Soul Sessions to fill your mind with cool, interesting psychological principles and make your life better. So the mother, if it's not one thing, it's your mother.
Yeah. So we've been talking about the kind of the family dynamics and how the shadow sometimes plays into these relationships. So we want to go a little bit more granular now and talk about specific relationships and how these how the shadow can play into these beautiful family dynamics, and how can we resolve them? How can we address them in a creative way that we don't need to necessarily go to therapy or drag our mom into therapy, but to
forgive the mother and all that stuff.
Yeah, but to really work on it on a creative empowerment level where it helps everyone. Become closer, really have great family relationships.
Yes. In particular, we're talking about mother-daughter relationships. Now, even if you're a man, think about this. There's always a woman in your life that you can learn from this about. So
yeah, and maybe next time we'll talk about the father-son relationships.
Yeah,
as well.
That sounds like a good idea. Okay. Well, let's talk about the mother and what a role she plays. I mean, in both men and women, she plays a powerful role. She's usually the primary caregiver in a families.
Yes.
She gives birth to you. You're in her body for 9 months. You are a part of her body for a long time. So it's like a very powerful bond that happens.
Absolutely. And this goes back to Freud. Freud said the relationship with the mother is the primary relationship, meaning it's your first real relationship with another human being. And it's very intimate, very dependent. And so it's a very powerful experience that we have through and with our mothers, our biological mothers. Jung says not only that, we're projecting the archetypal mother onto our biological mother. In other words, she's more than an individual. She is Mother Nature. She is the universe. She is life itself taking care of us.
And what a burden in a way for a mother to carry is that this baby is young child is projecting all that onto you, and you can't control that. And I think that we do have this, as little beings, this great expectation for this deity that we see as our mother, that's all good, all nurturing, all kind. And she can't live up to that ever.
Well,
I mean, a little bit, but it's like that infallible, pure, always there for you type of thing. There's going to be a little disappointment there.
Yeah, I think most mothers do the best that they can, of course, and do a pretty good job. But there's often these very subtle emotional undercurrents that we want to understand so that they don't interfere with us creating great relationships with our parents. So one of the phenomena that Jung talks about is this identity with a mother, because the child has certain objectives in growing up, and one of them is to create a persona for themselves. And so as the daughter, they often look to, what does mom do? How does she do it? So that I can identify with her persona and take on some of those qualities into my own persona.
Is that why little girls will play with dolls and little boys play with trucks, almost like default? Or is it because do the parents give them dolls? I'm just interested from a child psychology point of view.
That's a debate
right?
in psychology. Yeah, is it socially constructed, and is gender kind of socially constructed, or is it innate in us? And are we just we have these tendencies towards that?
But isn't it interesting that the toy, like most little girls play with, is a little baby? It's like they, kind of like mimicking the mother in a way.
Yeah. And so a lot of that just depends on your social point of view.
Yeah.
But there are good arguments on both sides, right? So it often ends up that it's 50-50. You know, half of it is genetically pre-programmed, and then the other one is socially kind of mandated.
Yeah.
So anyway, this identification, or we can say in this case, over-identification with the mother role becomes problematic for the individual child, because the aim of the individual life is to develop their own sense of self apart from the mother.
We're supposed to rebel against our parents and basically make our own decisions eventually.
Yes. So when there's this over-identification that I want to be just like mom from the daughter, that becomes a problem, because now she's living in the shadow of the mother.
Now, let me ask you a question about this. Is that like a norm, like almost everyone normally, you go through this stage, like we talk about childhood stages, like it's almost like a normal stage in the younger years to model the mother, and it's kind of a natural evolutionary thing. And then at one point it's supposed to stop. And then some people, they just keep in that pattern. Is that what you're saying? Is like, there's a, like in the beginning, there's always that, and then they break away. They're supposed to break away, and then when you're saying over identification, it's you really never break away. You never like choose that path. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, this would not be kind of the normal or the typical stages of that children go through, where they really love the parents and they want to be just like them. Those kind of are just natural growth phases.
Yeah.
Where what Jung is talking about more, that the individual gets to be an adult, but they're still very much tied to the mother.
It's almost like that enmeshment in a way that you there's no separate, like you don't think for yourself. You do exactly what your mother would do in a way.
Yes. You know, I come from an old culture in Mexico and Spain, and well, it's ancient, right? Like most cultures, but in our culture, the eldest daughter, not always, but sometimes the eldest, was expected to stay with the mother and take care of her, almost like be her handmaiden, and renounce her life, essentially, not get married, not have her own children, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that happens too, even if the father, especially now in modern life, the father leaves the older daughter and the mother's sick. The older daughter is usually the one to take care of the aging parent as well, or if there's a death.
It plays out it still plays out sometimes in families, because it's just part of those traditions or those tendencies that are passed down through the generations. And so there's this expectation that one of the daughters should renounce her life to devote herself to the mother. Now, of course, that creates an internal conflict in that daughter, because it's unfair, essentially. It's unfair. Why should she be the one who renounces her life while everybody else is going off and creating their own lives and their own families? That's kind of an obvious example of what we're talking about. But here it's playing out in a bit more subtle fashion, right? That the identity, in other words, the daughter herself is kind of initiating this over-identification with the mother.
It's like she doesn't have her own separate sense of self. It's more like a carbon copy of her mother, and she decorates her house the way her mother does. She dresses like her mother does. They spend a lot of time together. They talk every day, multiple times a day, and it's like almost like there's no individuation, no individuation, obviously, but no, like they don't make their own decisions. Would it be also they over rely on their mother's opinion for everything when they make a decision? Should I marry this guy? Like these two men, your mother says, I like this one. You tend to go for the person that your mother likes, where you're not even making your own decisions.
That would be part of it. Yeah.
And we're talking about extreme cases, we're all kind of do this in some ways, but we're talking about the extreme, right?
Uh, in some sense, but it's more common than we would think. In other words, if we go from house to house and just ask kind of what is the family dynamics going on here, I think we would see a lot of it because, again, these are ancient traditions, ancient ways of being and doing things that still persist, although we fall into them unconsciously now. And that's why we do this kind of work to try to bring light into the subtle nature of the unconscious mind so that we can create better relationships with ourselves. It's more dangerous not to be conscious of these things than to bring them to the light.
And so I remember when we were talking about this morning when I was in my 20s, early 20s, and I wanted to be a wife and have babies, just like my mother.
Yeah.
And it was so like driven in me that is how it should be. And now that I'm older, I'm a lot older than 25 now, I never had kids. And I think that through, like when you have those agendas when you're young, and it's based on like what your family did or what your family expects and what your mother modeled for you, it's almost like that wasn't really my conscious choice. It was like the choice of the environment I was in, of everyone around me. And when I chose the opposite, well, I didn't choose it consciously. When I remained single for a long time, it was almost like something is wrong with me because I'm not fitting in with the family. And now I could see how that choice to want kids wasn't really my conscious choice. It was a choice from my conditioning.
Yes.
And so when we think about when we make these choices, we're not making them consciously. And we're doing this like basically driven by that conditioning and not from, making, clear decisions of, is this really what I want? Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on. Like you say, the conditioning, the pressure, a lot of it feels like we're making individual choices, but we're not really making free choices when we're under those kind of pressures.
Can I ask you another question about, I'm going to anyways, a rhetorical question. Is it also because the child doesn't want to disappoint the parent? That the mother, that they want to be like them in order to not disappoint them? They want to please the parent?
That's part of it, right? Because if you think about the powerful influence that the mother has on the child, especially a young woman, right, or a young lady, she's bringing her up. In other words, she's very much involved in the way the child sees the world, and the mother has a lot of control over what she allows to come into that child's life. So if the mother is, let's say, hasn't individuated herself, is kind of neurotic, right, or is putting a lot of expectation on the child to fulfill her unmet needs. Now the child is under a lot of pressure from the mother to conform and to say, do, and be the way the mother wants her to.
So it's two egos, the mother's ego wanting to live out through the daughter's life. And then also sometimes when the daughter, let's say she gets married and has kids, and the mother's lonely, the baby got divorced, and then she wants to kind of like always be over and take care of the kids and like be in their life to kind of continue that mothering process, that devouring mother, where and then the daughter's afraid to set the boundary. And so there's this kind of that could cause problems in the marriage. We've seen that happen because the daughter can't separate herself from the mother.
Yes. So Jung has a quote here that I think will shed some light on this. So he's saying, she, the daughter, is content to cling to her mother in selfless devotion, while at the same time unconsciously striving almost against her will to tyrannize over her, naturally under the mask of complete loyalty and devotion. Again, we see the complex, the conflict, the internal conflict.
So the shadow would be the opposite of with the persona that she's creating.
Yes, right? Because the natural tendency in all of us is to individuate, to become our own individuals and live out our own life. Now here, with the influence of the mother, right, the devouring aspects of the archetype, like Jung would say, of the mother archetype, now the child is stifled in their growth, in their potential. They cannot grow. They do not appear to be able to grow or to break the bounds that the mother has created within the family system for them, and they feel trapped. And so, because of their over-identification, they seem to be devoted to the mother and to be willing to sacrifice their own lives, essentially, for the mother. But at the same time, the resentment is in the shadow.
So it's like, it's not always like this clear, I'm going to be like her and everything's wonderful. And
it's never like
there's
that.
always
never that easy.
Well, look at what happened with me. I ended up not having babies and not having getting married until I was later in life. And it's like almost like there's a part of me that was working against it at the same time, because our psyche wants freedom. Our psyche doesn't want, like the ego wants to conform, but deep within our psyche, it's called to individuate. It's called to do, like, push us beyond that pattern. And so there's always that push and pull in the psyche.
That's it. That it's always seeking balance and it's always seeking freedom. What stifles us, of course, is that we buy into the limitations that are taught or expected through the family dynamics.
Like the message of, you'll never be happy being alone and childless. Childless is, a terrible thing, and only children can bring you joy, and having a husband can bring you joy. You don't have a career, this is your life. And that message can be really powerful. And I worked with single people for many years before we started doing this certification. And it was really hard for people that hit the 40 mark and they're not having kids. And it's like this desire to be a mother. And it's almost like but I always find that they're working against that pattern of sabotaging it themselves, because they're not really fully individuated to really be clear. Yes, I do want this. It's a conscious choice versus a social choice.
Yes. And again, remember, we're dealing with archetypal patterns, so that we're not just speaking about the biological mother kind of being a tyrant or kind of inducing us into these limited states.
She's hypnotizing us to be like her.
It's that in our own psyche, we're projecting this powerful mother archetype onto our biological mothers. And therefore, it's a much bigger game that's playing out more at the psyche level.
It's almost like the clay is the potential, and then it's poured into the mold of your mother and the personal mother, and then that's what you think mother is in your life. And there's no in the beginning of life, there's no other possibility.
Yes. And so this is oversimplified, of course, but it gives us templates from which to begin a kind of self-exploration of what has been my dynamics in the family, and what has played out that I can see and make conscious, so that I can free myself from those patterns.
So let's go to the opposite. Yes. What if you resisted the mother and said, I'm not like my mother? Anything but my mother. I've heard so many people say that.
Yeah, exactly. So this often leads to a fierce rejection of maternal values. In other words, when you're throwing out the mother role,
the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yes, you're also throwing out this maternal value, right? That is really important, or could be very important for you later on in your life. And often we make these decisions kind of while we're still immature. We're still growing up.
Well, for example, I see a lot of women that are very successful professionally, and they would tell me that their mother was the doting wife, the kind of like didn't work. The father controlled all the money, and the mother really had little power. Like that was their perception. And so they made an agreement that they would never be like their mother, and never let a man, because in some cases the father was cruel to the mother and critical and harmful. and I'll never let that happen. So I'm going to create this other persona, which is independent and not dependent on a man, and also not emotional. Like if the mother's too emotional, like, oh, she was always, emotional all the time. And so they kind of like almost like reject all of that and become this stoic, very successful, powerful person, but they lose sense and connection. And not all cases, but in a lot of cases I've worked on, they lose a connection to their own emotional life because they associate it with the feminine principle, the mother. And they're not doing it consciously, obviously. They're not saying, I don't want to feel, but it's almost like they almost neutralize any emotion because for them, they associated that with the weakness, with lack of power.
That's right. So Jung calls this the negative mother complex. This is a classic in Jungian psychology, the negative mother complex, of course, because the child, the daughter, is essentially rejecting the mother as a viable role model for developing her own persona. In other words, she's saying, I don't want to do any of my life the way I've seen my mother do it.
And Jung has a great quote. The motto of this type is anything, so as long as it's not like my mother. I could get a dime for every time I heard that. This rebellious attitude often leads to compulsive and rigid stances that ultimately bind the daughter to the mother, even as she seeks to free herself. Carl Jung. That's the key here, is that just whatever you're pushing away, you actually give it more power. That's and right. You're actually more attached to it.
That's it. That you're very much entangled in your mother's life by rejecting it. The more you reject it and try to run away from it, the more you're moving towards it and you're creating it in your life. So essentially that if the individual doesn't do this inner self-examination or self-exploration, she ends up becoming just like her mother. Exactly what she set out not to do, she creates it, because whatever we resist persists, right? Whatever we're pushing away, that's what we end up creating.
And we end up having tendencies like our mother. So let's say that professional woman who rejected her mother as having children and all that, but she unconsciously adopts some of that attitude at work. Some of the things, maybe submission to men at work, but it's unconscious. Like, why don't I stand up for myself against that boss? Or why don't I, go for that promotion? They're even though consciously they want to be strong and independent, it's like they can't run away from what's been embedded in them. The experience of that early life with the mother is in them somewhere. And so it'll manifest somehow, and it will be unconscious and out of their control. Or they'll end up having clients if they're therapists or coaches, but even team members that reflect the mother, and there'll be judgments on them about being too sensitive, or, it'll show up somewhere. And so you can't hide from your psyche. Whatever you push away will show up out in the world.
That's right. Yeah. And in most people, like you were saying before we started the podcast, it's more subtle, right? That we, let's say the daughter will accept some things about the mother's persona and reject others. So it's not that clear, or it's not black or white, right? These examples just kind of will give you an idea of what kind of dynamics are we talking about and how can we approach them. Once you then start to work with individuals, you can kind of parcel out those elements of what did the daughter accept about the mother's persona and what aspects did she reject. And those go more into the persona and the shadow of the individual daughter.
And there's usually one parent that you just kind of accept and love, and you don't really think they're the problem. And then the other parent, you feel like it's so rigid. Your judgment on them is so rigid. It's just really weird how that happens. Why does that happen? Is it just they trigger more in you, or psychologically there's something genetically like too matched up? Because you see kids, like there's 4 of us in our family, and we all have different bonds with different parents. So do you think it's a genetic thing too?
Absolutely. There's so many influences that go into our behavior. There is epigenetic components, right? And epigenetics was still really new but beginning to really be understood as an important influence in how we behave. Genetic information or genetic predispositions, right? Things we inherit directly from our parents and our ancestors. Then there's conditioning, right? Operant conditioning. In other words, the way where we act and the way we receive the feedback from the parents and
like
the
so the
environment.
punishments and the rewards that we get early on shape us.
Very subtle shaping of our behavior and our attitudes. And then our natural predisposition, right? Our these stages that we go through, rebellious stages or kind of,
and we have them. We all have a little bit of rebellion. I remember like growing up, like in my family, the boy gets to sit at the table, and while the girls get up and clean off and do the dishes, and my mother's cooking, and the boys don't belong in the kitchen. And my brother, he was in charge of the garbage, taking the garbage out and doing the lawn. That's it. And we had to do all the housework, and it was very like resentful. Like I was like, remember when I was in my 20s, I didn't like to cook. I was like rejected all that stuff. Even though I wanted a husband and I wanted to have babies, I was like, I don't like to cook. I like to go out to dinner. So it's like that subtle like part of rejecting the feminine or rejecting that, like that role that we've been pushed on in our life. And so it's healthy to do that too, because we don't want to be like both extremes. It's healthy to have that kind of push away and like kind of finding your own way.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with any of these approaches. It's simply that the more unconscious we are of them, they're going to play out in really important ways in our life, and they're going to determine essentially what kind of life we have. So once you understand that, it's unacceptable to be totally blind to their power. We want to understand some of these things so that we can make free choices beyond the conditioning power of culture and society and all that.
And so the answer, what's the healthy resolution?
Yeah. So let's look at Jung's quote on this one. He says, the great task is to free oneself from the unconscious influences of the mother without losing contact with the nurturing, protective aspects of the feminine principle. In other words, he's talking about the archetype again. This involves recognizing the mother as an archetype and not simply as a personal figure. Such integration allows the individual to embrace the maternal aspects within herself without being overwhelmed by them.
So Jung's whole, in a nutshell, it's all about balance. It's all about not black and white, not extreme, but seeing like masculine and feminine, seeing good and bad, seeing all this rigidness, and being having that balance. And when things are out of balance, just like in the yin and the yang, it doesn't operate as smoothly. And so in our life, we want that psychic balance, and the psyche is always trying to reclaim that balance. So that's why when we have problems in our life, it's not because we're creating them to hurt us, but they were creating them to show where we're off balance. And so when you're feeling this kind of attachment or extreme or triggers, it really is an opportunity to say, what part of me is out of balance here? Like, what am I attached to that's, what am I not allowing to come in my life? And like I said, those professional women that reject anything feminine, they end up feeling like, I can't be emotional. I can't let my guard down. And then when they go, take their professional hat off and they go on a date, they're still like looking at the person that looks good on paper. That's a good business decision versus really finding someone they truly like connect with. And then what happens is they usually get the opposite. They get someone who's not successful, and they end up getting what they're afraid of, is someone who's going to just like break their heart. And so these cycles I keep seeing, like in the relation with the mother, and then how it shows up in work and romantic relationships and in friendships too. Like we're all trying to kind of come to terms with what happened, what our projection was, and with our mother in the world.
Absolutely. All of these factors determine to a great extent the destiny of our lives, because it creates like the structure through which we experience the world, right? We see everything through the lens of who we become as individuals through our families, through our cultures, through our education, all these things. If we're not aware of them, if we leave half of it out, or really a lot more, because the unconscious is much bigger than the conscious aspect of our mind. But if we leave at least half of it out by ignoring the unconscious elements that make up our behavior, we are setting up ourselves for a lot of suffering needlessly, because we're going to be playing out the things that we fear, the things that we're running away from, that we're pushing away. We're going to actually create them and invite them into our lives.
And so when things are showing up, it's really, we're seeing what we're unconsciously not paying attention to. And so that's why I really want to reframe in everyone's mind that when obstacles show up, they're there for you. They're opportunities. They're not something, we just keep pushing them away or just fixing the symptoms, and we're not really going toward what really is happening here. Why does this pattern keep showing up in my life? You can always go back, like I said, to the mother, because that's the core relationship. And it reflects our relationship with ourselves and our own humanity, our own nurturing, our own sense of power we see in our mother.
Yeah, and then one last kind of caveat. The individuation does not mean individualism.
Yes.
Like you've often said, right? Individualism is the idea that, I should be independent and do whatever I want to do. That's not what individuation means, yes. or what Jung meant by individuation. He means a real, genuine exploration of yourself, finding the true self in you, and then expressing that selfhood, that self-realization in a creative way where it helps everyone, including yourself, be more sane, more powerful in your life, more empowered.
Where individualization is really about rejecting the herd and being something different. So you're still rejecting. Where individuation is finding your own inner balance and finding out who you really are. So it's more of an internal versus an external. Yeah, it's powerful. So we'll talk next time about father-son, because that's also very fascinating. But we'd love to...
Or the mother-son relationships as well.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah. It's very powerful, the mother relationship. And we often think we grew up and our past is behind us and we just want to face forward. But the conditioning is there, and it's very subtle sometimes that we don't even realize it's there. And the goal of individuation is to be free. It's to be free of the past, not to reject it, but free to make our own choices and take what we need and take what we learned. And some things we take, some things we let go of, but it's a choice. It's not a pushing away. It's more of evolution. It's like going to the next level versus like when you learn what you learn in kindergarten, you don't go, I hate ABCs because I know them already. It's like, no, I'm going to the next level. I'm evolving to the next level. And that's what it's about. All right. Well, we hope to see you next week when we continue our series. Before we go, please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. We'd love to see you every week on Soul Sessions. I'm Debra Maldonado.
I'm Dr. Rob.
Signing out. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.